First of all, thank you for including me in this program. This paper is called The Design of Going Private Deals in Israel. I wrote it with two of my former students, Tal Weintraub and Dana Menachem. I think they're sitting somewhere over there. I always like to write with students. They're much more driven than I am. And I like to talk to lawyers. And this is something that I try to do in this paper because, and I'll explain in a minute, what's the issue with going private deals in Israel. Spoiler alert, we're going to talk about MFW in a minute, or in a few minutes. So this corresponds very nicely with the case that Asaf Hamdani wrote earlier. So let's start. The motivation here is that growing private deals in Israel and other places as well are becoming very frequent. Companies are going out of the stock exchange and becoming private. Here's the data. I don't know if you can see this. The red is the companies that left the Israeli stock exchange. This is delistings and listings in the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. Of course, not all delistings are necessarily going private deals. Some of the companies, note that this starts at 2011. This is, I think, when Zohar left, and some other companies said, you know, if Zohar is going, we're going as well. But the numbers are pretty high, and we're talking about more than 50, probably more than about 100 cases of going private deals in the last 7 years, I would estimate. So the issue here is that in Israel you have two legal mechanisms to go private. Here's a short description of these two mechanisms, because this is the gist of the paper, what we're looking at. One way of going private, here's all the information you need to know. We call this full tender offer. The story is like this. Because there is a potential conflict of interest between the controlling shareholder who wants to buy out the minority and the minority shareholders that want to be paid a fair value for their shares, the full tender offer, which is the mechanism that's legislated in the Israeli companies law, says that the controlling shareholder can buy up to 90% of the shares in the market. Once he reaches the 90%, if he wants to buy any more, he's obliged to make a tender offer to the remainder of the shareholders. If he gets the consent in total of 95%, so if he holds 90, he needs the consent of a majority, the 5 out of the 10%, then the tender offer succeeds and he can compel the remaining shareholders to sell him the 5 or less remaining shares. If he fails, then the tender offer fails, and he usually needs to make another tender offer at a higher price. This can also be done if the controlling shareholder holds less than 90%. For example, if he holds 80%, he can make a tender offer, but he still needs to reach the 95% threshold. So if he holds 80%, he needs the consent of 15% of the shareholders, which means 75% majority, and this is an important issue. I did not say that. Zohar said that in one of his papers. Zohar has a paper on everything. So this is an important issue. How are minority shareholder protected aside from this particular unique majority requirement? They can ask for an appraisal right after post the tender offer. They can go to the court and have the court in the litigation appraise the fair value of the shares. Another way that was developed by case law and papers and applauded by Asaf Hamdani and Sharon Hannes is the importing of reverse triangular merger to Israel. I'll call it merger for short. And the way this is done is using the merger sections in the Israeli companies law. You set up a dummy corporation wholly owned by the controlling shareholder, then you merge the dummy corporation with the public corporation, buying out the minority. In this case, because this is transaction with a conflict of interest by the controlling shareholder, you need to go through the process of the three-stage approval by the audit committee, the board, and the disinterested majority of the majority of the disinterested minority. What has become standard practice is using the special committee or the independent committee, as we sometimes call it here, in order to cleanse any questions about the decision of the board in this case. And then we have ex post litigation as well, but here what comes up is not immediately, at least, appraisal litigation, but first of all, a question of whether using, for example, the special committee cleansed the process, that is, did we adopt MFW or not? Okay, so what we wanted to do, considering the fact that the literature and case law applaud the fact that there are two ways, and basically argue that what needs to be developed is protections for the minority shareholders that make the two options, the two mechanisms, substantially equal in the final result, both to the controlling shareholder and to the minority shareholders. We want to know if this is really true. You can do this in an empirical way. I'm working on that. I'll probably fail. But we thought it might be interesting to tap the lawyers who are actually doing this and see what drives their decision-making process in choosing one mechanism or another, who's actually making the decisions, what are the important factors in making the decisions, and what they think about this. So we conducted a qualitative study looking at the theory, and our real intention is, first of all, to enrich the discussion with some insights from practice. We have some conclusions from this, but I'm not sure I'll burden you with all of that. So the way we did it is using semi-structured interviews with 12 professionals from the practice. Each interview was about 90 minutes. All the lawyers, some of them were actually here this morning, but they all went to make money. They're all, so this is why we anonymized this. This is a small industry. 12 lawyers is actually a big number in this small industry. They all have double-digit experience. Actually, most of them are more than 20 and some more than 30 years, have more than 30 years of experience in doing these kind of deals. They're all from the big leading law firms in Israel. They all handled these kind of litigation from every possible angle. They represented the corporation, the board, the special committee, the sometimes external acquirer, and so on. So they represented all the parties. The way this was going on is that we asked open-ended questions. In order to get in qualitative analysis, you want to understand the way they talk about this, the way they experience the process of conducting the deal. We had some assumptions, and if our assumptions were not addressed directly by the speakers, then we asked about our assumptions, and we let them ramble, basically, in order to see what's important to them. So this is not a statistical paper. This is more of a qualitative analysis paper, and here are some of our observations. I translated what they said from Hebrew to English, so there's probably some things that are lost in translations, but I'll try to make up for it with the theatrics. Okay, so first of all, who makes the decision to go private? Obviously, this is very trivial. The decision comes from the controlling shareholder. Sometimes it's forced on him by an acquirer who says, I want to buy control of the company, but not as a public corporation. First, get it private and then sell it to me. But I gave you this question because I think you could see that we did get some candor from the lawyers, because one of them said, look, I will never suggest going private. It's against my own interest because I lose the public corporation as a client. But the choice of mechanism is very important. So the choice of mechanism we see is actually driven by the lawyers. Even the most timid lawyers, some of them just said it, you know, we tell them what to do. But even the most timid, and I try to bring quotations, not from 12 lawyers, but just the ones that represent the unanimous or the majority, the significant majority of the lawyers we were talking to, said the following: look, the controlling shareholder comes to us with the idea of going private, and then we lay out the pros and cons of each mechanism. So obviously, if the lawyers lays out the pros and cons, he can drive the final choice of the decision maker, the controlling shareholder in this case. So what matters in making the decision? What drives the pros and cons? Number one, and this actually corresponds with Zohar's paper, the size of the block held by the controlling shareholder. This is number one. Everyone said it, and everyone said it the first off in response to the question. The closer to 90%, the more prone we are to suggest tender offer, which means the tender offer is likely to succeed. I should say, I skipped this, if a shareholder does not come to vote, does not vote, it's considered an objection to the tender offer, which means that it's very hard to get the 95% majority. If it's sufficient to have 5% or even less than 5% of voters that just don't show up, and you can't complete the tender offer. So it's important to have a small remaining minority. Another thing, another factor, an important factor, the composition, dispersion, and characteristics of the minority group. Or as one lawyer put it, are there control blocks in the minority? Why is this important? One of the words that came up again and again and again from all the lawyers is rational. And what they're really looking for is institutional investors in the minority group. And of course, there are many of those in Israel, because institutional shareholders are rational. If institutional investors are rational, who's irrational? We asked ourselves. One answer is the market. Lawyers don't know how the market will respond, or sometimes the market responds in an irrational way. That's one problem. That's what drives away from tender offer. Another irrational group came up when we asked, well, we said institutional investors means that we're talking about the importance of proxy advisors, because in Israel, in these votes, institutional shareholders are obliged by law to vote. And because they are obliged by law to vote, they usually use proxy advisory firms, or I should say proxy advisory firm. The most influential proxy advisory firm in Israel in the last 7 years is a firm called Entropy. And Entropy had an ongoing sentiment against mergers, arguing that mergers are a way to bypass tender offers. And every time Entropy was involved, the issue came up of Entropy's influential position on institutional shareholders. Here's what lawyers say about Entropy. This is PG-13 and on, I guess. We respect them, even when their position is unjustified. They're not the best legal experts, but you can't ignore them. Entropy's position is huge mistake. And finally, their influence is just crazy. In Hebrew, hazui. Okay, so obviously this is a significant problem, obstacle in conducting particularly mergers. Okay, and the third element that matters is time. Tender offers happen very fast, and if you noticed in the case, I think that Asaf wrote, there was 4 months of negotiation in the moot court. This is approximately the time that it takes, and sometimes longer, to actually go through a merger. If a controlling shareholder wants out fast, then merger is not an option. What about share price? This is usually an issue that we had to push because none of the lawyers came up with this. We asked whether the depressed share price could be an incentive. Our thought was depressed share price, along with the fact that you can play with valuations as much as you want, would actually go to the preference of mergers. And we were surprised by the response. This is why it's here in the paper, because lawyers said share price is just not important. Why? Because the court is going to set the price anyway, because you know there's always going to be a lawsuit. So in a way, this actually, the lawyers told us, this actually drives us to tender offers. Why? Because in Israel, tender offerers can limit the compensation to those shareholders that actually objected to the tender offer, which means they can actually limit the compensation to a maximum of 5% in terms of who they compensate, whereas in mergers you compensate the entire minority group. So you can control the size of your compensation in tender offers. What about costs? This is actually one of our most important findings. The process of mergers, this MFW process, costs, according to Israeli lawyers, give or take $1 million in terms of fees to valuators, appraisals, this short piece of paper that they charge a lot of money to. So in large corporations, this doesn't really matter, but in smaller corporations, and there are quite a lot of those small and medium corporations in Israel, this does matter. And one of the lawyers said the following, and this is a long quote, but I think it's really important. The process of the special committee is difficult and is burdensome. It's just too overwhelming for the board and for the independent directors to handle. It took them 2 weeks just to select an appraiser. And then they interviewed 5 law firms before choosing one. Why? Because they were told that the process is legally dangerous and they will surely be sued. So all these risks actually drive a higher cost in terms of the process of merger. And because the merger involves the board, we asked, how does the board's sentiment towards the controlling shareholder affect the decisions? Here we have a split 6 versus 6. One of them said it matters. Because basically the board of directors is, particularly the independent directors, are voting themselves out of a job. So they really have to like the controlling shareholder in order to agree to go through the process. But the other half said, look, the entire special committee process is a black box. No one knows what happens there. And then directors become really feisty and give a fight. So we don't really know what happens inside. What about the special committee and MFW? Okay. So we get different tones from the lawyers. Here's one view. If we were in the US, MFW tells you exactly what will happen if you follow the procedure. In Israel, you go through the procedure, it takes months, and then the court tells you that it does not necessarily mean that the court will not look into the fairness of the deal. You heard it today. So what's the point? When I go to the board and I tell them, I just can't guarantee anything. That was one view. But another view said, although the courts avoid saying that MFW applies here, if you follow the procedure, you have minimal legal exposure. It strengthens the tendency to prefer mergers over tender offers. Israeli courts import Delaware law, but not fully, and this is a problem. We don't have the certainty that you have there, but overall, if you apply the procedure correctly, it should make it easier to have the lawsuit ejected. In the language of Bill Savitt, if you eat the vegetables, there is a high probability that you will get dessert. One of the lawyers said about the special committee, everyone is skeptical in Israel about the cleansing function of the special committee. No one trusts the independent directors. But I believe it's independent and truly negotiates at arm's length. We were skeptical too, and we find some evidence also to support our skepticism. For example, what's the role of lawyers? Lawyers are, by the controlling shareholders, lawyers that work for controlling shareholder admit that they will significant influence on the choice of the lawyers who represent the special committee, and they admit that most of the negotiations are conducted not by the independent directors, but by their lawyers. And one of the lawyers actually said, I brought the lawyer of the special committee. Others just said, we presented them with a choice of lawyers, and they chose whoever they chose. So this makes us a bit skeptical. Finally, we asked them, considering all factors, considering controlling shareholders, considering minority shareholders, which mechanism do you think is fair? 11 said merger, 1 said tender offer. Here are representative answers. Excuse me for the language here. Tender offer is beep. a beep mechanism because of the majority requirement. There's always the last crazy guy that thinks the price should be higher. Good deals are lost. So the protective mechanism sometimes hurts the minority as well. This is what most of them said. Only one guy said, reverse triangular merger is not a real deal. It's, in England, they would find it totally unacceptable. It's not what the drafters of the merger clause in the company's law had in mind. But he was a single minority. This does raise the question, when you look at the numbers, you see that there are as many tender offers as there are mergers. What explains this as opposed to what the lawyers say? Well, we think that the reason is that most corporations in Israel are just too small for mergers. Mergers are good, considering the cost, for 100, 150 large corporations in Israel. But if you look at the 450 public corporations in Israel, you have a lot of small, medium companies that just can't afford the cost of a merger. Also, most of the lawyers we interviewed represented very large corporations. They just don't do tender offers. And maybe Israeli lawyers prefer mergers because mergers are more work for lawyers, and they also have a sense of control, because you can't control a lot of elements when you do a tender offer. You just offer a price and get a return of the market, whereas it's rational and there's someone to talk to if you have an institutional investor on the other side. Let me just skip this and go directly to our conclusion. There are a lot of conclusions that we can come up with, and there's a lot of part of the wordings that I left out because I wanted to be short post-lunch. But there is one observation that we find very important and distressing. And this is the fact that there is probably a very high likelihood that there are many small and medium public companies in Israel that are inefficiently locked into the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange with no way out, because they cannot reach the 95% threshold because some of their shareholders are either dispersed or just refusing to good offers. And they cannot afford the cost of a reverse triangular merger, so they're just locked into the stock exchange in a very inefficient way. So actually, this is also an issue in terms of inducing more firms to come to Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, because when you talk to lawyers about IPOs, they always say, I always look at the exit. And if you cannot exit, you might not enter the stock exchange. So there's some thought to be given here to alternative or easier exit ways to corporations that are listed or want to be listed in the Israeli Stock Exchange. Thank you very much.